in the area of regional design. He received an undergraduate degree from the University of Illinois and received an MLA from Harvard University. He is also a recipient of Charles Eliot Fellowship, which enabled him to travel throughout Europe. Between 1953 and 61, he was associated with the University of Illinois at various capacity. In 1961, Wisconsin Governor Nelson hired him to direct a recreational resource research. In 1963, he joined the University of Wisconsin, where in 1967 he became the department chairman of Department of Landscape Architecture. Soon after, he was named the department chairman of the Department of Landscape Architecture. He founded the Environmental Awareness Center, and he is today the director of that center. In 1974, he was named as the Jensen Professor of Landscape Architecture, and today I am very pleased to present to you Professor Phillips Lewis Jr.
Thank you very much, Homer. It's definitely a pleasure to be back in the White River Valley. I don't know if Homer knows this or not, but I was born in Lawrenceville, Illinois, which is only a few miles north of where the White River empties into the Wabash River in Illinois. And one of my first regional studies was of the Wabash River watershed, which included the White River. But tonight I'm going to try in about 75 minutes to give you a quick review of some of the fun that I've had in looking at the upper Middle West landscape over the last 30 years. I was in the Air Corps in World War II and learned a little trick of identifying enemy airplanes at 1/10 of a second. So you may get a slide blitz tonight that you might not have been expecting. But I think it's important in terms of reviewing 30 years of research in the upper Middle West to give you as many ideas as possible and let you whet your own discriminatory powers and be selective and exercise freedom of choice of what you like and what you don't like. For that, may we have the lights off, please? For centuries, we looked into outer space and we saw all those marvelous stars in the heavens. And somewhere along in history, some creative person, hopefully it was a designer, began to connect those brighter stars into constellations. Today, it's time we get down to Earth. We've had an opportunity for the number of years now to look down at the Earth at our urban stars. This is a satellite picture taken at night of urbanization in the United States. And more recently, we've been attempting to connect the brighter stars, urban stars, into urban constellations. That's the picture reversed. It begins to show you where human impact has been making a massive impact on the American landscape and where the American landscape is changing most rapidly. One can also suggest that that's practically where all the architecture is. It's practically where all of our major urban human problems are located. So it becomes a very important pattern. When I showed one of our space science professors at the University of Wisconsin that picture of the United States, he says, "Do you know over in our library, we have a collection of imagery of the whole world's surface taken once a day for the last 8 years. And I said, "No, I didn't." So he took me over. This is Italy. This is taken at night. Here's all the lights of urbanization, the Ruhr Valley. Here's England, London, Liverpool, and here's Scandinavia. Here's Spain, urbanization. Then you go down to Africa. Of course, in the underdeveloped countries where they don't have a great deal of electricity, it's more difficult to see where that urban concentration is concentrated. These great flares in North Africa are gas flares. But it's amazing. We're now piecing that together so we can get some idea of the total urban patterns on the world's surface. There it is reversed. I thought it was very interesting to look at that pattern. And that's upside down, you see. All right, then we came back and we started looking at the United States. All the cities of 20,000 or greater. And of course, most of them are in the eastern half of the United States. As you well know, much of the economy and people are beginning to flow out of the northeast concentration cities to the Sun Belt. So by just playing the little game of connecting dots, we take those cities of 20,000 or more, and we begin to link them into urban constellations. Now, much of my presentation tonight is looking at this one urban constellation that I call Circle City, where I've been doing most of my research in the last few years, starting out at Chicago, coming up to Racine, Kenosha, Milwaukee, up to almost to Green Bay, then across to Stevens Point, Wisconsin Rapids, Wausau, Marshfield, Eau Claire, Minneapolis, St. Paul. So you have Minneapolis, St. Paul here and Chicago here, then down through southern Minnesota and Iowa to Waterloo, Cedar Rapids down the Cedar River to Moline, Davenport, across Illinois. And I'll talk more and more about that as a prototype of how we as designers might begin to give form to these urban constellations. I think it's time where we no longer are thinking about individual cities, or should not be just thinking about individual cities, but begin to think about these total constellations. And how we look at the American landscape and the significant landscape resources as a form determinant to give form to those urban developing systems. Now you can connect those dots in different ways, and this is one of the ways that we did it. Here's Circle City, but there are these other constellations that form sort of a circle here. And we've been playing with this idea. Again, using, if you're going to guide the existing cities into constellations, can we leave significant resources in the center? Well, it's rather interesting. The center of many of those urban constellations, at least in this area, is what's called the driftless area, and I'll discuss that more in detail. But we have the Ozarks, we have the Big Thicket, we have the Everglades, we have the Smoky Mountains, we have the Appalachian Mountains. Magnificent landscape features like central parks to these urban constellations that we've been looking at. Here's the latest system, and again, there's Circle City. And Ball State fits right about there in this urban constellation that I see forming. And we've counted about 20 different combinations of constellations. And one of the things that I'm going to be trying to do in the next year or so is, can we bring the exceptional design talent and planning talent and agency talent together within these different constellations and begin to look at the carrying capacity of the land and how we come up with a new urban form that beefs up the densities within these constellations, slowing sprawl that destroys the holes in the donut. So we've looked at all the schools of landscape architecture, all the architectural schools, all the planning schools. And the beautiful thing about Ball State is you have all three of those talents here on this campus, all within this beautiful new building. And I think that behooves you to begin to put that all together and to really at least look at your own constellation and your own landscape that is necessary to sustain any urbanization that occurs. And then all the state capitals. Look at just all the state capitals. It's rather interesting that up here in this one constellation you have 7 state capitals with 7 legislatures and 7 governors, all dealing with that little landscape. Well, you get out here in the west, you get one little state capital. But how do we bring that talent together to look at the constellations? And how should we look at those constellations? Well, again, I'm going to be showing you over my left shoulder here at least what we've been doing in Wisconsin, to look at our own constellations. Here's Chicago, there's Indianapolis, so I suppose that's about Muncie, right about there. Here's Chicago, again, Racine, Kenosha, Milwaukee, comes up to Green Bay, there's Stevens Point, again, Eau Claire, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And this urban circle coming here. This is Rockford, Janesville, Beloit, and Madison, a little bit of a center. You look at it that way, Indianapolis is like an egg splattering on the landscape. Now, to prove that the local people of that circle city exists up in the upper Middle West in our landscape, we put together the population in 1970 and in 1978, and we showed the difference. Blue patterns are townships or cities losing population. Both Milwaukee and Madison, our two largest cities, are losing population, but the red townships are increasing. So you see where the loss is going, into that suburban sprawl. And here again you see the Fox River and the Wisconsin River and Minneapolis, St. Paul. But basically there's this pattern beginning to evolve, something like that. The blue are decreasing, and that happens to be the hole in the donut of Circle City, the driftless region. So again, to demonstrate, we put together the population by townships in Minnesota, Iowa, and northern Illinois. And this is the highest density in red, second highest density, yellow, and fourth, the white. So again, you see this density beginning to infill to Minneapolis. Then, of course, this is all rich farmland, and in Iowa, they've more or less kept the small communities from spreading on that rich farmland. But now down the Cedar River, you begin to see this density, high density, begin to connect and form and come down into Illinois. Well, we total up the population in just that Circle City, and there are 15 million people there. Now, New York City's roughly 9 million. There's 15 million within that center. And one of our biggest problems is to make the local people, including the governmental agencies, aware that there is that Circle City developing with 15 million people in it. They don't believe it when you first tell them. And yet, if you're going to do anything about it as a total urban system, it automatically means that you have to have Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin working together. And yet we have no interstate compacts that's really doing that. Years ago, when we did that first study of the Wabash River Valley, we managed to get an interstate compact between Indiana and Illinois, where we used staff members from Indiana and Purdue working with the University of Illinois and Southern Illinois to begin to get an interdisciplinary team to develop long-range plans for the Wabash. Well, let's look at that Circle City and how it formed. We go out in space and we begin to approach the Earth in the United States. Years ago, and at that period we had the Ice Age begin to slip down across North America. That ice sheet was 1.5 miles thick. Some people claim it was 2 miles thick. Can you imagine going out in front of the building here and looking up at a sheet of ice 2 miles thick? And think of the weight of it. We all know what the weight of the water is when the White River or the Wabash River floods. And we know all the problems the farmers have going out and turning that soil over the year after the flood because of all that great weight. Well, here was a tremendous weight that ground the landscape flat. And it kept coming south, gouged out Lake Michigan, coming clear down to the Ohio River and the Ozarks across southern Illinois. But in that great movement of ice, it bypassed this one particular area that we call a driftless area. No one knows why it was bypassed. But it's also interesting to know that Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin is right in the center of that beautiful landscape. It's the hilly, undulating landscape of Wisconsin. And there it is down to the Ohio, and there's the Wabash, and the white's in there somewhere. There's the actual pattern. It was quite a phenomenon. That's the driftless area. And Circle City, because of all the hills here, the railroads and urbanization began to develop around that system. Just as you have the Appalachians and the Smokies and the Ozarks, undulating topography, you have this tendency of urbanization to form those other circle cities in the United States. And we're beginning to put this together and refine the concept. Looking at Wisconsin, this is our driftless area. And it comes down here through, as I said, southern Minnesota, Iowa, and northern Illinois. Galena area is right here. Madison, the University of Wisconsin, right here in the Lake District. And there's a railroad that goes right down the Wisconsin River to join the Mississippi. Cuts right through this marvelous hill country. Taliesin is right here, the only major bend in the Wisconsin River. Wright designed Taliesin, shining brow to look right down both segments of that bend in the river. He was quite a site planner as well as an architect. And then, of course, the ice began to melt, and the flow waters more than fill Lake Michigan as known today, filled the Wisconsin River and the Mississippi River. And it looks probably something like that. And then, of course, after it left, the landscape was brown and probably absent of any kind of life. Of course, it moved back slowly, and life began to creep in as it receded. And when it had completely receded, we had a totally new landscape, a brand fresh new landscape of drumlins and esters and all the geological features that it created. And the sun came out and the greenery began to come back and return. And then, of course, we had the first little Indian villages, and the white man began to land. In fact, the white man landed up here at Green Bay 13 years after they landed at Plymouth Rock. And then, of course, they began to farm the land. And we had the beginning of the human glacier, altering the land in another regionally significant way. Now, as designers, I'm arguing for the field of regional design. Perhaps regional design is something that architects and landscape architects and planners and ecologists can begin to get together to consider in an integrated endeavor. How do we look at that marvelous landscape and, before it's too late, begin to guide urbanization in harmony with the significant landscape features that are essential to sustain urban patterns of the future? Well, then we built the railroads, and they kept building them. And there's the driftless area in the center, and circle cities beginning to form here to Chicago, to Green Bay, around this beautiful driftless area. And then we had the cutover period. The trees all grew back, but then we cut them all over, cut them down. And those trees helped build the architecture and the buildings in most of our cities in the east. White pine, beautiful white pine. But we still kept building. Now you begin to see it, Chicago, Milwaukee, Green Bay, Madison, Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Cedar River, and all these cities down the river system. If you look at the rail system, at least in the upper Middle West, you find that most of the rails follow those river systems. That's where you had the low flat gradient where you could build the rail corridor. Until there's about where we are today. We have the Chicago, Gary, Indiana complex flowing into Milwaukee, into Green Bay. But then if you draw a line from Green Bay through Madison to Moline, Davenport, this end of Circle City is all infill and sprawl. And that sprawl, without any kind of form determinant, is beginning to destroy the rich farmland that's necessary to produce the food and fiber for the future. So I talk about growth strategies, and I talk about this as design. How as we as designers can begin to give form to that. We're interested in siting houses on lots. We're interested in developing communities in harmony with their landscape. But how do you look at this regional scale? Because if you don't understand this context, you can make all kinds of major mistakes dealing at the smaller scale. So there's actually Circle City, and this yellow area, if you can see it there, is the driftless area, the hole in the donut. And yet we're still going to have a population explosion, lots more people. The latest figures suggest that we're going to add 5 times the present population of the United States, the equivalent of 5 times the population of the United States, to the surface of the world in the next 30 years. So what kind of housing is it going to be living in? What kind of cities is it going to be living in? How are you going to transport them? How are you going to feed them? That's a design problem, among others. We've actually gone from this to this. So now as designers, we can be aware of these urban systems. And we say, how are we going to feed that urban population of 15 million, maybe 30 million in another 10 years? How are we going to feed it? Well, there's one of the real bread baskets in the United States. Some of the richest soils in the world are located there, the flat prairie soils. means how do you manage those soils properly? How do you use farmlands as form determinants? I personally feel it's a crime against the people of the world to build on rich, productive soils. Fantastic soils. And yet in this country last year alone we built on 1 million acres of this flattest, richest soil in the world. United States, it's dark green, are the richest soils that penetrate up. This is winter wheat in Canada. But there's this rather limited corn belt, wheat belt, and tobacco and cotton here. It's not that extensive. That doesn't mean you don't have farmland in the other parts, but that's your richest soil, and we're sitting right on top of it here in the Middle West. And it's imperative that we protect it and use it as a form determinant to guide urban impact. Now, at the rate that we're building on land, farmland, Class A farmland in this country, there are some that claim that within 30 years, we'll no longer have surpluses. Surpluses produced from this rich agricultural base actually produced $32 billion of surpluses this past year, which enabled us to help balance our oil payments. It enabled us to help feed some of the people of the world. And yet within 30 years, if we no longer have that 32 billion, which will probably be 50 or 60 billion by then, you can imagine economically what it means to build on rich soils in our country today. And those rich soils are merely part of the American landscape. Now in Wisconsin, diagrammatically, it's rather limited. That's Class A farmland, a little patch over here. And yet when you look at the urbanization pattern, it's precisely where that key pattern of soils are located. So again, it's back to design. How can you design cities and tighten up the densities to keep sprawl from destroying that important resource? How are you going to provide it with water? We've got the greatest freshwater body in the world so far from the sea. Got your Great Lakes and all this marvelous water system, including the White. And again, we've got ample water supply for that Circle City, again, if we manage it properly. All this flow of urbanization to the Sun Belt simply doesn't recognize that they have a shortage of water there. And we're already getting pressure to put in pipelines to the Great Lakes to tap onto our water supply, not only for the Sun Belt, but to act as a slurry in pipelines transporting coal from Montana to the upper Middle West. It has to be looked at. We certainly should have a growth strategy to determine whether or not that's a wise decision or not. That water is a beautiful system, beautiful pattern. Another interesting thing that we discovered this last year in a sketch plan for North America, we put together all the water system. There's Circle City. And again, there's the White River, and Ball State's about there. But I began to look at this Mississippi River. It goes right up through Circle City and Minneapolis, St. Paul. Then we have the Minnesota River and the Red River, and then it goes into a chain of lakes that can be portaged. And where do you end up? In the headwaters of the Yukon. Now, I never for the life of me was aware as a designer that we had that marvelous pattern running north-south, clear up through the United States, right through the heart of the Middle West. There are a lot of my friends in landscape architecture that are trying to preserve the lower Wisconsin River as a wilderness river. And I'm suggesting that strategies might suggest with 15 million people circled around it that we should be dealing with that landscape as we would Central Park, that it should be park-like. If we want to save wilderness, 2/3 of this system is all pure wilderness, and if we have money to save wilderness, we ought to be trying to save that wilderness. It's also rather interesting when you look at the Yukon River, and it ends up in the Yucatan Peninsula. And when you look at the other resources of oil and coal, they're also running north and south. But in the United States, we always look east-west. We never look at that north-south system. And again, in terms of planning circles, I think it's time we begin to look at the north-south system. All right, how are you going to provide it with wood and minerals? Well, most of the north woods are located here with the mineral resources. Again, if we manage it properly, if we know where it is, if we heed the discipline that takes care of timber, of how we extract ores without destroying the landscape. And again, that's a design task. So we have the timber, beautiful timber. This is the actual timber pattern. Here's Lake Michigan, Chicago's here. There's Door County, if you know that. Minneapolis, St. Paul's here. Here's the North Woods. Nothing on this map but timber. This is the sand country. That's an old glacial Lake Wisconsin that formed as the glacier retreated. It's the sand country of Aldo Leopold, if you know that name. If you don't, you should introduce yourselves to Aldo Leopold in the Sand Country Almanac book. And then this is the driftless area where you have timber on the steep slopes of the hillsides, and the Mississippi River coming here, the Wisconsin River here. So we have ample timber, again, to produce wood and paper resources, if we manage it properly. But again, that's looking at design on a regional basis. And I contend that it should be being done on other circle cities and the resources that are needed to sustain those circles. Here's our mineral resource possibilities. From up here in Alaska at Prudhoe Bay, all the oil and the gas and the coal goes right down here to the Yucatan Peninsula. The north-south pattern. The farmlands are here, the water's here, the timber's here, the resources are here, the water system's there, and we always look east and west. Now you begin to put that team together, maybe we're talking about Mexico, the South, the North, Canada, and Alaska, and that becomes quite a political task. But there are tremendous resources there. And as I said, the hole in the donut is the driftless area, and I look at it as I would Central Park. With the energy crunch, people are no longer going out to Yellowstone in great numbers. They're taking shorter trips, and the impact on this resource is going to be even greater. And it means how do we get in there and develop a wise ecological and design plan to guide development without destroying that resource which attracts them there in the first place. I say it's like Central Park, only on a regional scale. If I do nothing more than tonight is to introduce you to begin to think broadly and creatively, and then look at what you're doing in the classroom on smaller scale designs, but always thinking how does that fit in some of these larger conceptual thoughts in the country. This is the character of the landscape. This happens to be my 33 acres. I know it's a beautiful landscape. It's where I recharge my batteries. Look down this Wyoming Valley, Taliesin's right down here. And then, of course, you get the junction of the Wisconsin River and the Mississippi River. A lot of people compare that section of the Mississippi as being as beautiful as the Ruhr Valley in Germany. I think in some cases, from a natural point of view, it's even more beautiful. So again, we've gone from that kind of an impact to the road system in most any state. That's the total road system in Iowa. You know, it's a fantastic impact on the American landscape. You can actually just look at the road pattern and you see the river valleys. Now, I also like to look at everything from a positive point of view as well as a negative point of view. I always look at that as public land. And if we give way to those automobiles, maybe we can turn that into interesting, at least trail systems that connect our public lands into a total network of open space for the state someday in the future. But again, I keep going back to the American landscape. Unless we understand the beauty of all those various patterns and its carrying capacity, how can we ever fit those patterns of human impact in harmony with it? And it's that landscape is the life support system of all of us. It provides us the food, the timber, and the minerals, as I've been pointing out. But if we don't know where they're at on a national basis, we don't know where urbanization is occurring and going to occur, how are we going to guide it unless we do have a growth strategy, hopefully led by the fields of design, working together? That means going back and understanding that landscape, the subsurface patterns, the surface patterns, and the above surface patterns. It means once you understand those patterns, then you have something to act as a form determinant to guide the patterns of urbanization. But unless you have the inventories that understand that fabric, it's impossible to fit the patterns of people. You're going to design a new subdivision, you don't understand the soils and the ecology of the site and the climate. You simply make all kinds of mistakes, just as you make at a larger regional scale. Now, I had the good fortune to develop an open space plan for the state of Illinois, and then Governor Gaylord Nelson passed a 1-cent sales tax on cigarettes that brought in $50 million to acquire land in Wisconsin. And I was brought to Wisconsin to look at the state, to look at its landscape, to determine which patterns were important for recreation. Now, to do that as a designer, I said, well, there are 4 flat patterns in the land that offer recreational potential. Water is probably the most important, just as you know how important that White River and these reservoirs are around Muncie. The wetlands, the floodplains, and the sandy soils adjacent to water that provide us our swimming beaches. Those are patterns, and designers deal in patterns and relationships of patterns. Water can be a beautiful system, many different forms. It's not flipping up there some reason or other. Was that the end of that? Okay. So you can look at the wetlands. In southern Illinois, we call these swamps. When I got to Wisconsin, they call them marshes. And these marvelous marshes serve as aquifer recharge areas. They permit surface water to penetrate into our underground storage systems for future urban water supplies. They filter water coming out of our streams before they empty into our lakes. They act as marvelous habitat for wildlife. They're beautiful through the various seasons and the colors and the textures and the patterns. In my judgment, they should be preserved and enhanced. At least the Class A ones should be preserved and enhanced, as well as Class A farmland. And we should utilize these as form determinants. And then, of course, there's land form. There's the flat prairies of Illinois and Indiana and Wisconsin. And then you get varying degrees of slope. You get into the driftless area, get up to about 12.5% or greater, and that in our area is used as pasture. You get above 12.5% or greater, it's usually in timber and steep topography. And I would contend that we at least ought to preserve this steepest of topography of 12.5% or greater. The slope is very important. At the top of the slope we have rims, and we can walk for miles along the rims in the driftless area, or in Brown County, Indiana. For miles along this system where we look down and look at the magnificent landscapes below. I had a teacher, Stanley White, in landscape architecture at the University of Illinois. He was the brother of E.B. White, the editor of the New Yorker. And Stanley always said, what we've got to perform is a trunk murder on the landscape. You dissect it into all of its many patterns and then put it back together again. Well, a rim pattern in Wisconsin has never been considered to be as important as the rim or the shoreline of its many thousands of lakes. And I contend it's just as important as the shoreline of a river or a lake. It's a place where you get up and get a vantage point. Now, as landscape architects, we can classify that rim. Here's a man standing on the rim, no trees above, no trees below, trees above, no trees below, trees below, no trees above, trees above and below. And unless you understand that, it's impossible to lay out trails of sequences of visual delight. It's all the same pattern, it's monotonous. But you can begin to weave this landscape and weave the human impact in harmony with it. And then along the rim we have observation points. We get out here and you look down, great feeling of superiority and release and looking down at that magnificent landscape. It has all kinds of value. This is my point in Iowa County. I can go up here and sit there for about 10 minutes and recharge my batteries completely. So what I've been saying in the landscape, Indiana or the upper Middle West, the water, the wetlands, the floodplains, the sandy soils are important, the slopes of 12.5% or greater, and the rims. And hopefully we treat those patterns with tender loving care. But you don't treat them with tender loving care unless they've been inventoried and mapped and you have regulations and implementation tools to guide their wise use and development. And at the base of my slope, or my rim, is a cave. So you have all kinds of additional physical features in the landscape that are important to somebody. I can take a picture of my cave, or I can draw a sketch of the cave, or I can create a symbol that portrays cave as a value. In the state recreational plan, we created 220 different symbols to portray the different physical resources that are meaningful to somebody in the land. And there's swimming beaches, the highest point in the state, hiking trails, bear habitat, 220 symbols. There's a symbol for cave. So I showed you a picture of a cave, I showed you a sketch of a cave, or I can show you a symbol of a cave. But now with symbols, we can plot them on a map and show people where those patterns are located, so you can begin to develop some kind of concept and awareness that they're there and that they should be protected and enhanced. Well, that means getting out into the landscape and looking for them and plotting them on the map. Now, the most exciting thing that I've discovered, and I've looked at half the states in the United States now, but in our Wisconsin study, if you block out the rim, the slope of 12.5% or greater, the water, the wetland, and the timber pattern, and you plot these additional 220 physical values held in high esteem by the public, at least we have discovered in all those studies that 90% of these values fall in that same pattern, often in concentrated nodes that we call nodes of diversity. And those are the areas that we recommended for acquisition under our $50 million Outdoor Recreation Act program. We bought practically over 33,000 acres of these choice resources in the first few years of that program without any federal subsidy. In other words, what we're talking about is understanding that landscape fabric. And to do that, it's not just the landscape architect that's doing that. It's the whole natural and earth science community. The soil scientists, hydrologists, geologists, meteorologists, wildlife ecologists, working as a team. But the landscape architect, I think, has a great deal to do in looking at natural open space and spatial resources as a resource, and can conceivably be the one person that can graphically portray those different patterns and relationships of patterns. Now, when you block all of those corridors together in the state of Wisconsin, that's the system. And all I have to suggest is if I could reach in and pull that system out, I'd be removing all the diversity of the state of Wisconsin. It'd be like the flat prairie of Illinois, where you look for miles without any kind of diversity. It's that pattern that gives personality and contrast and change to the Wisconsin scene, just as it gives diversity to Indiana. As I flew down here this marvelous, beautiful, sunshiny day this morning from Chicago across northern Indiana, I was struck with the fact that there's probably more woodlot and timber in northern Indiana than there is in southern Wisconsin, which you think of as a timbered state. But again, it's looking at those patterns. It's looking at those streams with timber along their boundaries. Or its other interesting pattern is coming down from Chicago was to look down and see the railroad corridors and how many of them are timbered on either side as far as you can see. Looking at those patterns and understanding them, and then beginning to determine how do you fit your urbanization and human impact in harmony with that as a system, because it is our life support system, and we're destroying it very rapidly. Well, there's the little map that we produced of the state of Wisconsin. We've identified all of those key features, and we're now trying to see where those key features, land features, are they subject to immediate impact and change and obliteration, and how through design can we fit it in harmony with that basic system. Well, after the Wisconsin study, I had a contract with the National Park Service, and we looked at the Mississippi River Valley. And then after that, I had another contract to look at the Great Lakes Basin. And I can assure you that within that system, practically all the natural and cultural features lie adjacent to the water wetland system in these corridor-like patterns. Then you can begin to look at urbanization. Here's Detroit, here's Minneapolis-St. Paul, here's St. Louis, almost an equilateral triangle. And in the center of that is Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, and Rockford. So we can begin to look at all those other little cities and where those cities are making the greatest impact on the greatest diversity, and begin to suggest priorities where you go in with detailed ecological surveys to guide impact before it destroys the diversity. In other words, we're saying we preserve both these natural and cultural treasures for future generations if we have the will to identify them and to devise wise guidelines for their interpretation, protection, and wise development. Once you've identified those key features that you'd like to preserve and enhance, as a designer, we begin to think of where not to build. And then you can outline those systems, and there are areas where it's more appropriate that you can build without destroying these exceptional values. It's where to build and where not to build, and where to build and where not to build. So again, we go back to Circle City, and we say, look at that urban sprawl. And we look at the 20 urban constellations in the United States that are more or less sprawling in all kinds of directions. And we can diagram that. Here's Chicago, and here's Minneapolis, St. Paul. Each of these cities in Circle City are all sprawling at the fringe area. And yet there's a rail corridor in there, the most appropriate place for a mass transit system, As it runs through the city, we have mostly derelict land in the heart. I contend that in most cities adjacent to the rail corridor where you need the density to support mass transit, there's enough room there with creative new architecture to more than take care of most of the growth in the next few years and slow the sprawl that's sprawling and destroying the very resources needed to sustain the city. So we took an example. This is Madison, Wisconsin. University of Wisconsin's here, Lake Mendota and Lake Monona, and the capital sits here in the center of the isthmus. And we did a very detailed study of the isthmus, and we discovered that a third, or actually more than a third, of the isthmus had no buildings on it, while we were sprawling out here to Easttown and Westtown, new shopping centers. So we get into what to build. Now, I'm not an architect, but in looking at space and densities, I think we've got some ideas that I'd like to pass on to you for your perusal and maybe some feedback. First of all, I said we looked at this whole isthmus, the capital here and the university here. We plotted the red, the rail corridor, and rail yards, and unfortunately you can't see the parking lots. But when you combine the parking lots and the rail corridors and yards with the street system, you've got more than a third of that whole isthmus without any buildings on it, without any densities. And yet people in Madison want a mass transit system to do that. Well, they won't have the mass transit until you beef up the densities there. So how do you beef up the densities next to the rail corridor? It becomes an architectural design project. We built a three-dimensional model, again, to develop an awareness on the part of the public. Because if we can't make the public and the grassroots aware of these concepts, we never get the political support to do anything about it. You can't quite see this. Here's the green is university, little university, and blue is big government. And here's the deck, that whole wasted space. Well, the city planners have got some suggestions for single-family housing of all things right here, a little bit here and a little here. They have simply failed to look at that as a total system with a potential mass transit system. And now we have a group now that are trying to develop a concept looking at it at that scale. There again is this wasted corridor. And you look at any of those cities in Circle City or these urban constellations throughout the country. So diagrammatically, it makes sense to me at least. If you have that wasted space adjacent to the rail corridor, some way, diagrammatically, how do you beef up the densities above that to provide the ridership for mass transit? How do you collect all the waste into integrated utilities? And then that rail corridor is the best place and easiest place to put your utilities in any city. You don't have to rip up streets or anything else. So then you begin to get into, at least looking at the corridor in Madison, we have Lake Monona here, and there's this great embankment here that goes up to our state capitol, and that's been all intensified in terms of urban design now, a very beautiful surrounding area to the capital city. But you come out here, and there's a drop-off to the rail, and it separates the capital from this beautiful view and lake shore. So I've been talking about space spanners. Frank Lloyd Wright actually proposed a new civic center here that would bridge this rail system and build a civic center. It was never built. But what we're talking about are space spanners rather than skyscrapers. As we know, it's costing more and more energy to go up. And then to move hundreds of people up and down, that consumes great quantities of energy. Maybe we can begin to build a deck here that lets your multimodal transport and utilities remain at this level at grade. But then we create a whole new architectural complex or system above this as a system. Within that system, this happens to face to the south, provides all kinds of options for solar. It ties the Capitol Square with a great fountain place, open space in the wintertime in the cold climates of Madison, to the shoreline where you might have restaurants overlooking the shore of the lake. But you're also dealing with different land uses mixed within this architectural system. It's not a building, it's a system. Off the Capitol Square, you might have the businesses here, tie into the business area. You might have governmental office rental, you might have condominiums, and this might be public, as I said, tied to the recreational shoreline of Lake Monona. Well, those are the kind of concepts we're dealing with. We've been working the architects at Circle Campus. We don't have architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, it's over at Milwaukee. So with all my former contacts, the University of Illinois, they're all at Circle Campus, and we've been working with them. But I think in the country, you're beginning to see examples where you're using those air rights over transportation systems. All you have to do is look at the Gulf of Mexico and begin to see that we've already experimented with space. Surely we can build a prototype here on the surface of the Earth. A good friend of mine, Jack Diamond in Toronto, designed this structure. Some of you are probably aware of it, University of Winnipeg, not Winnipeg, but Alberta. This is a building, a 3-block long building built over the street system running through the campus. In that very cold climate, students can walk the entire length mostly of the campus, and this building ties together single buildings on campus. These are shops and these are student dormitories. The structural system made it such that these units rented for far less than our rental units at the University of Wisconsin for student housing. One of our architects, local architects, has proposed a new MATC training center to do practically what we've been talking about. The capitals over here, this is the cross-section to Lake Monona. And that was the first sketch plan of it. And then, of course, you're all aware of Mosey Softy trying to create higher density systems and mass-produce modules. And if we look at mass production now in terms of what kinds of building we put on those platforms, all you have to do is to look at some of the new systems of creating facilities that fold up and store. And this was a total household, the bed folding out here and the kitchen here. And the kitchen, I think we're seeing is going very rapidly towards these types of modular systems that plug into frameworks and structure. But in Madison, at the west end of the campus, we have the Federal Forest Products Laboratory, which developed the laminated beam in this country and has probably one of the greatest concentration of wood technologists in the world. And I'm working with the assistant director now in this area of using paper as a major building material. They claim that they have paper now that's as strong as steel, it can be fireproof, and he's working on a way of keeping moisture out of paper. Well, if within 3 years he has a breakthrough, we'll have a material that you can fold into any color, shape, texture, or form. You can layer it for complete insulation, and you can modularize it and put it within some kind of a lightweight structure. I personally feel that the architecture of the future is going to be a very, very flexible architecture. In terms of land use planning, when land uses are continually changing, we cannot change those buildings. It's too costly today to renovate massive structural systems. And I think we're going very quickly to lightweight structures with modular systems that plug in that can be altered very quickly when land uses change. But I think we're going to paper as a building material. All you have to do is look at some of the new German books on paper folding as an art form and look at the marvelous patterns that one might come up with in terms of housing. Many of my architecture friends are really a bit frightened about going to these higher density massive structures. They say it's too easy to build in monotony. But I show them a book that was produced by a man that photographs snowflakes for a lifetime. And every snowflake is different and very beautiful. And yet it's nothing but a series of modules put together in very beautiful forms. And I personally feel that in terms of getting that flexible architecture, a beautiful architecture, that if you're a creative designer, it can be done. Again, then you have to get into working with the physiologists and the psychologists to begin to determine how we do react to these different environmental situations. And that's probably the weakest link in the environmental team. Now then, conceivably, you could build your paper plant up near that wood supply in northern Wisconsin. You cut a tree, and you put it in this end of the plant. It comes out this end as a module, and you rail it in place into that derelict area in all of our cities with your space platforms, and you lift it out and plug it in. I think there's enough examples of concepts, at least coming off the drafting boards of the world, to say that is within the realm of the possibility. You merely lift those units off and plug them in. The present form, of course, is to an individual cutting a tree, and the tree falls, they pick it up, they take it to the sawmill, they set it aside, then they come over and they pick it up and they run it through the saw, then they stack it to dry, then somebody comes up from the city, picks it up, takes it to the lumber yard, unloads it in the lumber yard, a contractor comes over and picks it up again and takes it to the site, and the carpenter comes up and picks it and puts it together. And I think some way we've got to speed up that whole process. And there are all kinds of systems, pages and pages. We're also experimenting in Madison, of course, with taking the trash in the city and grinding it up and turning it into different building materials. So maybe you don't cut more trees, maybe you use the waste of the city to build your city of the future. Well, what I'm building up to is in the past we had big houses at little cost, and today you know how many people can afford a single-family detached house? Not many. Some way we have to come up with that mass-produced, lower-cost material if we're going to provide housing, I think, for the future, especially to all those that we really need the great needs. We might be able with paper to come back to low-cost housing again, which is really a thing of the past. And I contend that unless we do get into that area and be more creative, that our foreign friends are going to take that market away from us, just as they took the automobile market away from us. When we didn't make that change from the gas guzzler, when we weren't creative, our foreign friends produced this little economic unit, and it took the market away. I contend that our European friends will be coming over here with mass-produced modules for housing unless we can be more creative. And I can say that about many things that we're doing in this country. We've got to be more creative, and we've got to have some action and demonstration and prototypes to show people the differences between things. Now, going back to Circle City, after looking at the landscape and looking at least one of the urban constellations that I contend are throughout the United States, we then said, here's Madison, maybe we can make it a prototype where we can experiment with these new modular building material systems. But there's the Milwaukee Railroad that cuts right through the center of Circle City, and it's gone bankrupt. So we've been looking at that as a possible rail park concept, but a rail park in which we have many educational demonstrations of how you go in and work with the farmers at a township level to identify their value system and protect it and enhance it and build in harmony with it, how you work with the small communities and guiding them to come up with a more livable place, and to create a whole series of demonstrations, not unlike the ag experimental stations. It shows how to grow food and fiber in the various landscapes of the state. So we've been in my Environmental Awareness Center. I might mention something about the Environmental Awareness Center. I have no budget. We have a nice space devoted to us. You could take this space or any other space here. And we went out and developed contracts around the state. We've run more than $2 million through our landscape department. Those $2 million went to students to work on live problems, basically along that transect in the heart of Circle City, to serve as demonstrations of what might be done within the rest of the area. So we went back to the Wisconsin survey. Here's Madison, there's the lower Wisconsin River, here's the driftless area. And we selected this Milwaukee Railroad simply because it ties our second oldest city, Prairie du Chien, together with Madison along the lower Wisconsin River, parallels it. And then we have a marvelous system over here to Milwaukee, then down to Chicago and the Indiana Dunes National Park, or we can go up here to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and into the Apostle Islands and Lake Superior by rail. So we also looked at other studies. This is a study done by Dr. Hills years ago that identified where all the different ethnic groups settled in the state with their own foods and festival and architecture. Again, beautiful diversity. There's natural diversity and there's cultural diversity. And then we looked at the patterns. I divided the state up in the state recreation plan into what I call landscape personalities, different regions with different colors and textures and patterns. In my Illinois study, I could only discern 13 landscape personalities, the prairie being the predominant landscape. Up here, there's some 72 personalities. That's what makes Wisconsin a recreational state. The Lake District is concentrated here and here, the sand country of Allo Leopold. Here's your driftless region. In Wisconsin, you just go a few miles and you get a complete change of scenery. Well, if you understand that and manage it properly, again, you build in diversity. And then we begin to look at the relationship of the railroads, as I said, to all that diversity. And again, some further studies of the rail system. And what we discovered that in my earlier studies, where I demonstrated that most of the natural and cultural features fell adjacent to water, and that's where we built our railroads, it's possible from those new potential high-density cores of our cities using the rail corridor that people would merely drop down by rail, and you'd have access to all the exceptional natural and cultural diversity of the state. And the beautiful part about it, if we can save a rail system, is to control people. You can let them out where you want to let them out, rather than having 1,000 cars running all over the landscape, making an impact. So we looked at this rail system from the Indiana Dunes through the Cook County Forest Preserve system, the park system of Milwaukee, the Kettle Moraine National System here, Oregon National Wildlife Area, the Madison Park System, the Lower Wisconsin, the Great River Road up to the Minneapolis Park System, the St. Croix River up to the National Forest and the Apostle Islands. It's now a national recreational area. Saying, could we connect these jewels into a magnificent park rail concept? And we looked at all these key rail systems that link diversity. This one, of course, is Circle City. It might be an urban form. But then, as a foil to that urbanization, how can we develop some kind of a concept that acts as a foil to that urban system, as a massive network of recreation and open space serving that area? Linking again Chicago, Milwaukee, and there's a loop here, then down to Wisconsin and up. Now, part of my task is to convey these ideas, because unless you convey the ideas to the public, no one ever does anything about them. They don't even consider them. But then with Circle City like this, I argue in the city of Madison, it's imperative that we save that rail corridor down the Wisconsin River that ties this marvelous driftless area to the city of Madison at least. So now we have new legislation in the state that allows, if the railroad goes bankrupt, the counties can join together and form a corporation, and then at a low interest rate, something like 2% from the state, they can actually acquire the rail corridor, and then they bring in short-haul operators to operate the line. Well, the transportation department is dead set against moving people by rail. They don't want anything to do with it. And I think there's a social responsibility. It's an energy-saving device. It's a marvelous system. I think it's a priceless system in my judgment. And yet we're abandoning it all over the state. But they argued, well, you'll never get any short-haul operators to operate that line. And 70 short operators bid on the system. And the operator that was given the task owns something like 7 steam engines and all kinds of diesel equipment. And he is now considering moving a steam engine down this system, and he's trying to line up a system from Madison down to Chicago. Even this fall, he may move a steam engine from Chicago to Lake Geneva, and if that's successful, he'll move it down this marvelous system, maybe put people on the Delta Queen on the Mississippi and take them to Minneapolis, St. Paul. So we've been trying to portray that, again, as designers, as regional designers. Here's Madison, and here's this lower Wisconsin River down to Prairie du Chien. All that marvelous valley, Taliesin, there's Spring Green right here, Taliesin sits right there. We have all these other beads of beauty along that necklace. So we've laid that whole system out. Here again is Madison, down to Spring Green, Taliesin, down to Prairie du Chien. And one of the things we discovered is that whole lower Wisconsin is in the public domain. All that green is public property. So you have a rail corridor linking really Milwaukee, well, Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, all down the Wisconsin River, like a huge park right in the center of the driftless area, in the heart of the 15 million people in Circle City. So we put together all the civil units, and we're working with all those counties and the cities within that area to think of that as a system. Again, all that public land. Here's Madison. And we've built a three-dimensional model, again, to demonstrate it to people. Here's Madison, the isthmus, and the 2 lakes. And the railroad comes right down here. You know, a few years ago, we tried to build national parks in and near our cities where the people are located. And the Indiana Dunes National Park is one of those, down near the densities of Gary. And yet one of the greatest problems is we had bumper-to-bumper traffic. Here we got a railroad that ties the cities together with all this marvelous resources, and they were thinking about abandoning them. It just doesn't make sense. Then from Madison going east, we looked at the Milwaukee Railroad as it makes a loop tying to Milwaukee. And here we have the Kettle Moraine Ice Age National Park with a trail system going down it. So people could come out by rail here, get on the trail, walk down here to Old World, Wisconsin that we designed, and go back to Madison. They come up here to Shawangunk National Park, National Wildlife Area, and float down the Rock River and get back on the system, or they can come on into Madison. Looking at networks. So again, we've looked at the utilities and the counties and the townships and trying to get those people together. And we built a three-dimensional model, you might say, looking at that rail corridor 1 mile on either side. We've created a little document for 4-H students, where the 4-H students are now identifying the exceptional values within that corridor, talking to their mothers and the grandfathers and grandmothers to see if they'll support protecting that as a system and showing the importance that rail corridor connects all those marvelous physical, natural, and cultural features into a marvelous system. Then, of course, at this end is the city of Milwaukee, and within the heart of Milwaukee is the black neighborhood, where they have some of the most, the greatest number of unemployed black youth in the nation, of all places, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the rail corridor makes a loop right through that area. So we went in there working with extensional services in the heart of Milwaukee in the black neighborhood, working with the Ombudsman program, and we've been working with all the land uses in the area, and we discovered that the black neighborhood, 90% of the blacks are concentrated in that one neighborhood adjacent to the Milwaukee River. Well, then looking at it, we found that the highway department had ripped the new interstate freeway system right up through the center, dividing the neighborhood into two. Then they ripped the east-west freeway through and tore down all the houses. And then looking at the studies, we discovered that 30% of all the open space and recreational needs of the southeast region of Wisconsin, 7 states here in the southeast, 30% of it, the needs, are right here in the black community. And they're not about to let you turn any more buildings down, because with the highway department ripping out all of the houses, and then absentee landowners going in and buying the houses, and they mysteriously burn down and they collect the insurance. There are literally hundreds of vacant lots. So they're not about to let you tear any more houses down. So what do you do about it? Well, as a demonstration, we're suggesting, and we produced this little document, going in and working with the black community. We began to look at the neighborhood, and we found that the neighborhood, the streets are 4 cars wide. They're actually maintaining more street surface than suburbia. And we say when you begin to replace some of your streets or your utilities, rather than resurfacing the old area, we would only resurface half the street. Make it one way, it's 2 lane. And as we continue to do that, and on the other side, we do the same thing. And we end up with one-way routes, slowing down traffic and the rip-off artists that's present there. We connect neighborhoods. We take the old bricks, many of them very beautiful, and we turn it over to allowing the local youth to begin to develop much of this themselves. And this was one of the plans. We put cost estimates on this, just finished doing that, and we show that we can do this at a fraction of the cost of urban renewal, which means going in there and tearing buildings down and dislocating more people, which the local people won't allow in the first place. But we can begin to do something like this, and we can begin to create a human service network, you might call it, throughout the neighborhood, where the black mother can sit on her front porch and look out and supervise her children in front of the house rather than sending them down 2 blocks away. But again, another demonstration of what it could be like on the rail corridor, where we might even move the legislature or the students at the university out to see these live demonstrations in the countryside. Another thing, we've developed a 170-acre Nike missile site into an awareness center. It's immediately north of the black neighborhood. I wanted an awareness center where people could come and learn of the life support system of the region and regional planning effort, but also some of these concepts of how you rebuild the inner city. And I'm now happy to report that the Department of Natural Resources has now acquired this 170 acres. They have plans, and they just voted the other day to move ahead on building a multi-$1,000 facility as an awareness center there. And our Milwaukee Railroad goes right through the site. So it'll be another demonstration on our chain of events. A few years ago, we convinced the State Historical Society that they should build an ethnic village, and it's Old World, Wisconsin, which is also right on the rail corridor. The rail corridor goes right across the north end of the site. This was all built, it was the #1 bicentennial project in the state of Wisconsin, where we moved people, where we've restored all the interesting architectural components around the state. In most of my regional studies, I began to discover that most of the people from the old world sought out landscapes that looked similar to the landscapes at home. The Finns sought out the Lake District, where they have their saunas, the Germans, the rich farmlands, the Cornish, the hills, and the mines, because many of them are miners. So we analyzed this site and looked at the different features And then where we bring back a German cabin or a Finn cabin, we've located in harmony with the landscape that those people began to seek out. There's something like 30 buildings have now been restored, and it's become quite an attraction in the state of Wisconsin. And we're having, with all the many ethnic groups in Milwaukee, they're now staging different performances. And each week, the last year, they've had a different ethnic menu at a week at a time. So it's becoming quite an attraction, again, to become aware of the natural and cultural diversity of the state. And we've been working with the farmers in a little Dunn township, a rural township at the edge of Madison, where urban sprawl is beginning to occur, and working with them, acting as a designer, visualizing their value system. Our students merely put those values together with their help. And we've come up with an open space system. They've adopted this system of protection of that total open space system in the township. And some of the developers got quite upset with it and brought out their own slate of candidates for town board, and they won by a few votes this last time. And it woke up the people that actually got this plan initiated in the first place. So I think we're going to see a great battle and threat in the backyard of the legislature. They're beginning to look at that whole system of how you work with the local people to identify their value system, what happens in terms of politics. And I think we're going to see in the next election a reversion back to the local people getting control and actually protecting that as a system. But again, it's another prototype. Then we're beginning to come up with all kinds of concepts for the use of that rail corridor through Madison. And then a few years ago, I had a grant from the Endowment of the Arts, or I looked at a 21-mile open space system in the heart of Madison, the capital's here. And we laid this out, a 21-mile open space system, a bicycle system that connects the university with really an outstanding arboretum and Nine Spring Creek and back to the capital city. And more than $1 million has been spent now in acquisition of land through here. The county itself came up with its own plan. I call it an E-way system, an environmental, educational, ecological, excellent way, call it what you may. But it's a system, merely again, this idea of linkages, of identifying exceptional demonstrations and linking them. So now we've come from Milwaukee to Madison, now we go again back down the Wisconsin River to Prairie du Chien. And we're going to go from here down here and look at the demonstrations in small town design that we've developed. First of all, we come to Spring Green from Madison. Taliesin sits on this little hill here. And we've developed a complete plan that's been adopted now. We've got the town board that worked with the city. We have extraterritorial controls over the exceptional resources to serve as form determinants. There's no more sprawl and outlying shopping center. All the money has to go into the central business district. We've looked at all the buildings, come up with concepts of how to restore it back to the original historical facade. We've looked at the interior spaces and come up with concepts of how they can enhance that, and they're moving ahead on some of these plans already. Then we turned out a little handbook for any person that comes into the driftless area to acquire land. It's amazing how many people from Milwaukee and St. Louis are coming into that hill country, just like they're probably going into the Brown County and acquiring sites. Well, this is a handbook that guides them on how to understand that landscape and where to build and where not to build, and how to be sympathetic to the farmers' needs within the area. And then we produced this little document for the town officials and how to set up a planning commission that can do the types of planning we're talking about. And this is the only document that the town board officials has ever circulated in the state. They've circulated about 2,000 copies of this to town boards. Then within this whole driftless area is the Kickapoo River Valley. There's been a great battle of the Corps of Engineers to build a dam here and dam a very beautiful canyon. And it's just been recently that both political parties have said it can't be built. And now they're working with us. We're developing a detailed plan for how to develop that whole valley and look at creative options. And again, we start out with the soil patterns and the cross-section and look at the carrying capacity in terms of guiding development. There was one little town that's set in the floodplain, Soldiers Grove, and we came up with concepts of how to move that central business district out of the floodplain onto higher ground. And it was written up recently in Time magazine. It's a whole new solar community now that's being clustered and built. And practically all the buildings in the downtown have been moved. So again, that's within a mile or so of the of the rail corridor itself. And then as we come down the Wisconsin River towards the Mississippi, we come to, as I said, the second oldest city of Prairie du Chien. And we're going to come down here and look north. The city of Prairie du Chien is here, and there's an island out here. That's the first major core project on non-structural solutions to floodplains. They're moving the people off of the island. It's a very historical island, and we're developing plans for its rehabilitation. Here's the Wisconsin River entering the Mississippi. This is north, and so you come down here and go north. There's the island. Here's the city. We've developed a comprehensive plan. It's now being published. Here's the city, and there's the island. This is the bridge you've probably been reading about that was almost to fall down, brand new bridge. And there's the island and the city. And we've developed a plan here that here's the rail corridor. The rail corridor comes from Milwaukee to Madison, comes down here, goes out on the island and ends at a historical building, Villa Louis, one of the best historical buildings in the state. And what a terminus with historical log structures out here, all kinds of archaeological sites. And then we found that most of the historical buildings are on these two streets, and we have a walking system worked out here. We proposed an awareness center here where people come in here, learn about the driftless area, then you can get into the marina. They go by boat down to Cassville, a restored historical village. They can go over right across the river to the Effigy Mountain National Park, or you can go up here, all kinds of fishing, or they can take this walkway to the Historical Medical Museum and through here. And then this serves as an awareness center, which is directly related to the high school. So we'd hopefully making the youngsters of the community more aware of the values in their own region. And then, of course, we've been looking at the Central Business District. The lower section next to the island is all historical, and we have plans and hopes that we can restore that segment and create a new little segment at the other end of the Central Business District. And, of course, the Delta Queen ties up here right below the Villa Louis. The rail system's here, and there's an old hotel that's in bad repair. We hope to restore that. So, again, this whole system, looking at it like a series of jewels on a necklace, but as demonstrations where you can show people the differences. Now, do you really want a rail park? Well, we had some creative thinking in the past. Before we had the automobiles, we put all of our great hotels and our national parks on the rail system. There was always the railroad restaurant and hotel, and people enjoyed themselves getting there. And in fact, they had many forms of transport. And these marvelous places we could end up on. And as the energy crunch begins to tighten up, I think it's imperative that we begin to look at the relationship of our high densities, our rural resources, those linkages that move people to various places economically. And of course, this is all gaining support in the state of Wisconsin. As I said, the short haul operator has this operation now tied up and this operation, and now he's working on this railroad. He's about got that tied up to Chicago. Now, another thing we've been talking about is how can you transport ideas out into the area? Preservation, restoration of the resources by arousing, expanding, deepening human sensitivity to the environment. Means to communicate. What to communicate, to whom to communicate, and how to communicate. I worked with industrial designers at the University of Illinois. I said, we can have trains that have educational booths aboard where people are educated as they go out to these various resources. Maybe we need a modular system that you can port aboard a train. And each module will have a different story about the resources of the region. And maybe once a year you bring those all together and you tell all the stories maybe it's a new county fair, or you can pack all those modules up from all over the counties and all the state and bring them to a state fair. Again, arousing, expanding people's opinion of what they have. So again, we talk about Circle City, and now we're talking about this rail corridor as a connector. We hope we use that as a prototype, but it can be expanded in terms of a network. And of course, on the national scale now, there's a professor at the University of Virginia that's created a whole new steam locomotive that's going to be much more efficient than the present locomotive. Now, of course, in Wisconsin, I point out that really isn't dreaming. that we have the Circus World Museum there that used to take these little modules with wild animals all over the United States to develop an awareness of wildlife in the world. So with the industrial designers at University of Illinois Champaign, with this idea, we had the EAC, Environmental Awareness Center module, and we played with it, different concepts. Some of you ought to have a sketch plan and play with this yourself. And then you'd plug them together and people could walk through learning of the values of their region. Seems to be stuck again. And really, it goes back to this module, a containerized freight unit. This little unit lifts that on the back of a truck, or you can load it on a boat. Here it is. Here's a rail system, so you can lift it onto a rail system. You can put it on the back of a truck, or you can put it on a boat. So you have complete flexibility in taking stories out to the public. And as I said, on this whole rail system, Madison is the core of this, with rail corridors radiating out in all directions. It's the state capital of State University. And there was the old Wisconsin idea where at one time we really had the university and the state agencies working together to create all kinds of new creative legislation in the state. So I think it's really the hub of this whole network. So we developed a plan for the Dane County Coliseum. Here's the Capitol and the Isthmus right over here are acres and acres of the Dane County Coliseum. They have the Dairy World Expo there. And we came up with plans of how to expand that, including an awareness center where we have an interdisciplinary team representing the university and the state agencies to be housed there looking at creative options, but a place where the public can come and see those options and be stimulated to bring about change. Now, this concept of an awareness center is a core to this system. It's a place where people can come by energy-saving devices. Hopefully, we would blitz their minds with the beauty of the region, either with techniques like this at the Canadian Expo or Disney World, where you take them through the landscape and really rub their noses into the beauty of the region and what they have. There's such an apathy on not understanding or appreciating what you have in your own backyard. We built this little 360-degree theater with 9 slide projectors. We can take people through any landscape or on this rail system from the Indiana Dunes to the Apostle Islands. I built one for the architects up at the University of Minnesota, and now they can take people through walks through the city or through the region, again making people aware of what they have. Then the Awareness Center, you take people through with hands-on computer, walk through profiles, back screen, slides, and film strips, computer data, maps, look through glass plates and see the relationships of water, wetlands, steep topography, a place where the public can become more aware of what makes their region or their urban constellation different from any other constellation. As I believe in a democracy, that we have to preserve options. We have to understand the uniqueness of place and preserve it and enhance it, as I said earlier, so that people can see the differences between things. They can whet their own discriminatory powers and be selective and exercise freedom of choice. And when we reduce everything to sameness, we don't have those options to see or to select from. So these centers would be geared to really what makes, let's say, Muncie, Indiana and the White River Valley different from any other. And how do you design in harmony with it? There could be all kinds of walk-through experiences to show the cross-sections and the vegetation of the area, to make it exciting to learn. Instead of kiddies shooting each other with these television sets, they play energy games and have just as much fun. And then, of course, with laser beams and holography, there's untold opportunities. Disney's new Epcot Center, you know, the corporations of Exxon and Coca-Cola and Kraft Cheese and all of them are putting $900 million into that center to simulate the future. I'm not so much impressed by the stories that those corporations want to tell about the future, but the concept is beautiful. It's how you get balanced judgment of what those options might be. In St. Paul, at the Omni Theater, they built this beautiful theater that simulates the creation of the earth, at least in one film called Genesis. You're sitting in here and with this equipment, observatory equipment, They turn out the lights and you're projected into the heavens. It's like you're floating out there. And one of those little stars begins to turn red and pulsate, and all of a sudden there's Big Bang Theory, and pieces come hurtling at you, and people scream and practically jump out of their seats. At least you've overcome apathy. And once you get settled down again, then you begin to see the pieces begin to consolidate and go together and create the earth right in front of you. And you see the shield shift on the surface of the earth. Then they take you on helicopter flights down the frontal edge of a glacier and across the top of a volcano. They fly you across Africa down the first valley where they found the first fossils of people. It's a terribly exciting experience. The last time I was there, the ambassador from Mexico was there, and they're buying 3 of these sets from Mexico to visually communicate to the public in Mexico. Again, I feel that we as designers, a visual communicator of creative options, it's a critical task that's ahead of us. And we have the talent to do it and to take leadership. Again, in there you'd show the beauty of the upper Middle West. You'd show that there are many components in the environment. Now again, I think maybe too much emphasis has been placed on just nature. Talk about the environment as being energy, air, water, land, people, and habitat. And then we want to get across the story that there's only one thing permanent about any of those components of the environment. They're all going to change. They change in the seasons, and they change through the years. And we might show them how energy was produced in the past, how it's produced now, and how it's going to be produced in the future, showing that the components do change. And we can simulate the cities of the past and the present, making it creative. But we want to bring out that an ethic simply must guide this change that's occurring in our backyards. There are 3 types of ethics. One is egoism, where you're not willing to share your resources with anyone. There's short-term universalism, where you're willing to share your resources with this generation, but you don't really care about future generations. And there's long-term universalism, where you're concerned about this as well as future generations. There's a lot of talk recently that, well, maybe we won't have too many future generations, but I firmly believe we will, and we have to begin to plan for it. All right, then you point out all the great philosophers of the past that have been saying this very same thing for centuries, and it's time we begin to believe them. Then we bring them into a participatory democracy theater. This particular one is based upon the one at the Czechoslovakian Pavilion in Canada, where you had an individual on the stage, his image is blowing up here and here. This one argued the pros and the cons of the issue, and the public had push buttons out here that could vote on the issue. So, for instance, he might bring up the fact, are you going to be willing to pay $5 a gallon for gasoline in another few years? And you get an instantaneous feedback. And this image argues the pros and the cons of the issue. I would like to have an interdisciplinary team of talent that can look at that issue from many eyeballs and many points of view. Is it economically acceptable, politically acceptable, socially acceptable, ecologically, aesthetically, functionally, philosophically? So we create a 3-dimensional impact statement that's a creative thing that allows the public to participate in the decision-making process. And I think much of the apathy on the part of the American public is based upon their inability to be a part of the decision-making process, to see creative options that we as designers can visually communicate. And of course, what it really gets back to is to build that team that can look at change in a comprehensive fashion. I've talked about the natural and the earth sciences can look at the carrying capacity, and then these creative designers that can create new human form, and then the marriage of those two, so we can build without destroying the very life support system that sustains us. As I said, that requires an interdisciplinary team in the very thought of it. As I said, I congratulate you at least on putting architecture and planning and landscape architecture together. Hopefully you can make that work, and work as true friends and true professionals that have this massive task ahead of you. So there's the natural and earth science team. Hopefully this team can work with whatever natural sciences you have on campus to understand that carrying capacity, let's say the Muncie scene. To work with the physiologists and psychologists and sociologists to get a better understanding of the basic needs of people to keep them healthy as well as the land. To work in terms of satellites connected to computers or overlays to portray those resources, to store that data, comprehensive data, so that it's easily accessible. And then, of course, as you have going here, this very creative capability of taking that knowledge and manipulating it into new forms for society to compare. I'm not saying as planner or designer we're telling them what to do, we're showing them creative options and giving them the opportunity to debate and be a part of the decision-making process. And then, of course, we're in the planning field in terms of the art of implementation, social sciences, political science, economics. And then, of course, how do you communicate? In my judgment, one of the real failures in the country is our inability to communicate to the grassroots so that they see the options that are available to them. Not just putting the data together, but how do you communicate it so they understand and put the pressures on the politician to bring about change? And then, of course, simulation. How do you simulate those options so they can truly see? Or how do we get a few prototypes built? I argued in Madison, how are we ever going to get the youth of the city or the oldsters of the city to appreciate mass transit when there's no example of mass transit within 100 miles of the city of Madison? How do we see that those prototypes are built? I think that's one of the roles of the university, to assure that those new prototypes are built. Creative new simulation activities. This is a simulation of the past at one of those resorts where they simulated the whole destruction of Pompeii by Vesuvius. Think of the cost, think of the action, think of the excitement. All right, an interdisciplinary team of people, what we're coming to, a holistic approach to planning and guiding change. But hopefully it's led by creative design teams. A process where you can bring that team together to collect and catalog, to verbally, visually enhance, option displays, public viewing. I won't go into this, there's a whole book being produced on that. And then how do you get these centers actually built? A number of years ago in the Upper Peninsula of Minnesota, not the Upper Peninsula, upper part of Minnesota in the iron ore range, a friend of mine, landscape architect Charlie Agar, brought me up. He was doing a plan for the iron ore range. And I went up there, and he wanted me to give him some advice on recreation planning after I'd finished my Wisconsin study. And I looked out across that desolate landscape, completely destroyed by man, to bring iron ore out. This is actually growing up now. But he said, now what can we do with this to attract tourists and make it a recreational landscape? Well, I said, Charlie, there's only 3 stories that you've got to base upon. One is you've got this marvelous story on how we utilized iron ore to build the cities of America. 2, we've got the stories of what man can do to the landscape to totally practically destroy it. And 3, you brought in all these different ethnic groups to mine the area, and there's that whole story of those immigrants coming in and finding a new home in Minnesota. Well, they just now have finished a new facility, the Iron Ore Range Interpretation Center, that touches on all of those 3 stories. And last year they attracted something like 250,000 people out there in the middle of nowhere to learn that story. So I say that these centers, wherever they're located, in creative places, and we have a whole range of ideas how to guide those, we locate them, but we also tie into the Ag Experimental Station. Because our Ag Experimental Stations are located in different parts of the state that demonstrate different farming practice needs. Especially in Wisconsin, we have a short growing season in northern Wisconsin, so there's a story there versus longer growing seasons in the south. But then we look at the food and the fiber that's being produced in that unique landscape. We take the food and fiber and we put it in the farmer's market. And that farmer's market is unique from any other farmer's market because we're using the indigenous foods. Then we take the ethnic groups of that area and the ethnic recipes, and we take that indigenous food and we create an ethnic restaurant and food display. We encourage the craftsmen of the area to produce great works of art reflecting the local colors, textures, and forms and patterns of the region. We challenge the artists to create great works of art reflecting, again, the character and the landscape. Again, the center is how do we make people aware of the uniqueness of that region and what makes it different from any other. And then, of course, why can't that be a new resort center for the state of Wisconsin where we have active sports and exercise, the types of things you find at any resort, where it's fun to come in here to learn. One of the greatest changes in the state of Wisconsin since I went up there is that when people go to a resort or out for a vacation, they also want to be educated. And our university extension is now setting up extensional courses at our resorts. But what better way of being educated than coming into a center like this in each region that makes them aware of what's there and what to see and how to go out and see it. So we're talking again about some kind of an architectural facility. I'd like to challenge the architects to design one. Circle Campus Architects are working on this. But a center that could be located near the rail where you have plug-in units that could then be taken out by rail to the various parts of the state. Again, it goes back to this little module, Italian module that folds out for contractors' place. And you could take it out, and you take the interdisciplinary team out to the small communities and give them some sense of a cross-section of the values there. And within the next year, I hope to have a national conference at Madison where I can invite many of you and the creative people from these different constellations to look at this as a concept. The administration now has discontinued the Great Lakes Basin Commission, the Appalachian Commission, the New England Commission, and the Ozark Commission. And maybe one of the new concepts is how do you use university talent, student help. At least I've utilized student help the last 15 years. And I think it's one of the most underutilized talents probably in the country, where the students are not only given theory, but are taken into the field to work on live problems and to begin to work and to organize for each constellation, to begin up with a concept of how you tighten up that density, how you preserve these marvelous landscapes that are necessary to sustain the city, how we can break away from this separating the rural scene from the urban scene and begin to integrate it into a holistic endeavor. Now, in terms of the awareness centers, I point out that, a few years ago, our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers practically mortgaged their lives away to build a courthouse in practically every county. My father was a county judge in Lawrence County, and I spent a lot of time in a courthouse. It's a place then and even today where people go to get new answers, but the answers have become more complex. So again, I challenge the architects to come up with a facility that can house that interdisciplinary team, that can present these options to the local people, so they can become more aware of the options available to them. Now, how are we going to finance it? Well, it's rather interesting. What I've been talking about really is a major peace movement. It's saying, how do we bring peace between people and their life support system that we're destroying? How do we do it? Well, maybe all we have to do is look at our defense posture. I was in World War II, and I was in Poland here a few years ago, and I know we need a defense. I don't know how much, but I know we need a defense. But how do we give ourselves the defense posture? We build total universities. We built West Point, Annapolis, the Air Force Academy, the Coast Guard Academy. We build total war colleges, where we look at all the options of the future in terms of defense. In terms of mobile units to take messages, we have ships and planes and billion-dollar budgets. Surely in this country, and surely in the upper Middle West, we can see the sense of beginning to create these creative centers where the public can come and truly look at the options. For really, the real strength of the country are our people and our resources. And if we don't manage that and enhance it, it doesn't matter what kind of other defense postures we have. The cost of sending a man to the moon or building platforms in space before we can do it even here on the surface of the earth. It seems that we should begin to question and debate some of these issues. In our own small, meager way, as I said, every university that has a design staff can set up an awareness center and begin to bring the interdisciplinary team of people together. I have one staff member, Tom Lamb, and a secretary, grad research assistant, student associates, and it's amazing how many people from the city are volunteering to come down and work on projects. At the moment, we have 50 people working on the local problems. We have an exhibit in our center, a 4-block-long exhibit that more or less presents this philosophy, and more people are coming through on visits. But really what it amounts to then, in sort of summary, we have the landscape at different scales. We have the home, the neighborhood, the community, the township, the county, the region, the state, the Midwest, the country, and global. Now, I don't have any problem going to University Extension and getting monies for a conference on the home, because they know there's a lot of people that know the difference between a kitchen and a living room. But when you try to bring people together to look at the Midwest or the United States, there are decreasing numbers of people that are even aware of what's happening there or even concerned about what's happening there. So my plea is to at least challenge the design professions to really think about regional design. And regional design not only looks at that, but it looks at all these other scales and the relationships of these. And I contend that if we aren't aware of those, what you do down here, normally you can make very tragic mistakes in terms of a total growth strategy. So again, we can go from looking at the total upper Middle West clear down to looking at a flower within the Indiana dunes, those two scales. We either do it or we continue at our rapid pace of deterioration. And I think that the design professions must take the challenge and take the leadership and begin to portray to the American public the creative options that we know are possible. Thank you.
Professor Louis have agreed to entertain any questions you or any comment you want to make.
I'd be happy to try. Well, it's been a pleasure for me to be here, and I hope within a year when I'm trying to round up that creative talent throughout the country, you'll participate. I've been invited in October to give a colloquium in HUD where they've invited in 30 key people from the design and planning professions and agencies to hear this kind of a story for 3 days and to debate it and see how we might get a major program focused on those constellations off the ground. We're also going to try to set up some kind of foundation that would provide the funds to help do that. But I see Ball State, and that's one of the additional reasons I really wanted to come down here, because I see you sitting in strategically within the country, within these patterns of constellations, being a very strategic point in making a contribution to this total area. We have Southern Illinois is in another constellation. We've been talking down there. And Stanley Mendelsohn, the former planner from Jerusalem, is down there in the design staff. And he's going to be participating. So I think the Midwest can really take leadership along this line of growth strategies. And I think all the students can also play a major role. Any other questions? Or what's the first question? Yeah. I probably blitzed you to death, so maybe we better break it up, and I'll be available for questions later. Okay. Thank you very much.